At my daughter's wedding, my sister introduced me as the unemployed relative living off the family. She had no idea who her boss had been looking for all along. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. My name is Maya Bennett. I'm 56 years old, and for the past 3 years, the word most people have used to describe me is unemployed. It's funny how one word can erase an entire lifetime. When people ask what I do now, I usually smile and change the subject because it's easier than explaining everything that happened. What they don't realize is that I didn't lose my career. I walked away from it. 3 years ago, I was a senior operations executive at a technology company. I had spent decades working my way up through late nights, weekend flights, and missed family moments. I was proud of what I'd built. Then my mother was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. The doctors didn't promise much time. I still remember sitting in the hospital hallway while emails kept flooding my phone. Meetings, deadlines, project updates. My professional life kept moving while my mother slept only a few feet away. That was the moment I knew I couldn't do both. So I resigned. People told me to hire full-time nurses instead. "You've worked too hard to throw everything away," one colleague said. Maybe he was right, but my mother had spent her whole life putting everyone else first. For once, I wanted someone to choose her. So I did. The next several months became hospital rooms, medication schedules, quiet conversations, and little victories that only we understood. Some days, she joked with me. Other days, she barely opened her eyes. I don't regret a single hour I spent beside her. After she passed away, everyone assumed I'd go back to work. I didn't. Grief doesn't fit into a calendar. I needed time, not because I couldn't work, but because I wasn't ready to become the person I had been before. At first, my family seemed to understand. Then months became years. People stopped asking how I was doing. Instead, they started wondering why I still wasn't working. Family gatherings changed. Someone would mention promotions, someone else would celebrate a new job. Then there'd be a pause before my name came up. Maya's still taking some time. Eventually, that became, Maya doesn't work. It's amazing how a story changes when the people telling it weren't there for the beginning. My older sister, Linda Harper, seemed especially comfortable telling that version. Her comments were always disguised as jokes. Maya's the only person I know who retired without actually retiring. Or, she has all the free time in the world. People laughed politely. I smiled because correcting everyone at every holiday gets exhausting. The strange part was that nobody ever asked, "Maya, are you okay?" The only person who consistently did was my daughter, Emma. Emma was 28, kind, stubborn, and wiser than I ever was at her age. She never treated me like I was broken. She just showed up, coffee, lunch, long conversations on my back porch. Those simple moments helped me heal. One evening, she looked at me and asked, "Mom, why do you let Aunt Linda talk about you like that?" Because arguing won't change her mind. But it bothers me. I know. You could tell everyone what really happened. I squeezed her hand. I don't need to defend my choices to people who never asked about them. She sighed. It still isn't fair. No, I said, it isn't. After a moment, she added, I hate seeing people underestimate you. I smiled. Being underestimated tells you who's paying attention and who's only judging appearances. She didn't agree, but she respected my wishes. She stopped correcting relatives whenever they called me unemployed. Not because she'd given up, because I asked her to. A few months later, wedding planning took over our lives. Guest lists kept changing. Everyone had opinions. For the first time in a while, the family focused on something joyful. Then, 1 week before the wedding, Emma called me while I was grocery shopping. Mom, Aunt Linda just confirmed something. What is it? She's bringing someone important from work. Oh? My aunt says her boss accepted the invitation? That's nice. Emma hesitated before quietly saying, I have a feeling dinner might be interesting. Emma wasn't wrong. The week before the wedding quickly turned into organized chaos. Every time I thought we'd finished one task, 3 more appeared. One florist needed confirmation. The bakery called about the cake. Someone had forgotten to RSVP. And suddenly, we had to rearrange half the seating chart. I swear this guest list has a mind of its own. Emma laughed as she crossed another name off her notebook. It gets that from your mother. She looked up and grinned. I was about to say exactly that. Those little moments reminded me why all the stress was worth it. This wasn't just another family event. It was Emma's wedding. She'd spent months planning every detail, but the closer we got, the more nervous she became. One afternoon, we sat on the floor of the reception hall, tying ribbons around welcome gifts for the guests. Emma stopped working for a second. What if people don't have fun? I looked at her. You're worried about the wrong people. I know. No one's coming to judge the centerpieces. She smiled. I wish I believed that. They're coming because they love you. She nodded slowly. I needed to hear that. The next morning, a few relatives arrived to help decorate. For about an hour, everything actually felt normal. Music played quietly. Someone argued about where to put the dessert table. Two cousins couldn't agree on the color of the candles. It was the kind of harmless family chaos I'd almost missed. Then Linda walked in. She looked around and clapped her hands. Well, I can see who's been volunteering full-time. A few people laughed. I smiled politely. I had the afternoon free. Linda laughed a little louder. Of course you did. Nobody said anything. The conversation moved on. I told myself not to let it bother me. It was only a joke. At least that's what everyone would say if I reacted. A little later, Emma asked me to help arrange place cards. We spread them across one of the long tables, checking every name. Linda wandered over. So, what's it like not having deadlines anymore? I kept placing cards in alphabetical order. Less exciting than you'd think? Oh, I don't know. She shrugged. I'd probably enjoy sleeping in every morning. I actually wake up around 6. She blinked. Seriously? Old habits. For the first time, she didn't have a comeback. She simply walked away. Emma leaned closer. You handled that better than I would have. I've had practice. She quietly shook her head. You shouldn't have to. I changed the subject. Can you hand me the Reynolds card? She did. As the afternoon went on, more family members arrived. The room became louder. People shared stories. Kids ran between tables. For a while, Linda stayed busy talking about work. She seemed happiest whenever the conversation turned toward promotions, leadership meetings, or the executives she worked with. Even relatives who clearly didn't understand corporate life politely nodded along. Her husband, Mark, stayed mostly in the background. Mark had always been quiet, not shy, just careful. Whenever Linda made another joke about me, I'd catch him looking down at his phone or coffee instead of at me. Once, after Linda joked that I had the easiest retirement plan ever, Mark gave me an apologetic smile. It lasted barely a second. Still, it was the first sign that someone besides Emma realized those jokes weren't funny anymore. That evening, we gathered around folding tables to decide who would sit where during the reception. If you've ever planned a wedding, I said, you know seating charts can start arguments faster than politics. Emma rubbed her temples. I didn't know chairs could cause this much stress. I laughed. Welcome to wedding planning. For a while, everyone focused on solving problems together. Even Linda. I almost believed we'd make it through the week without unnecessary drama. Then I realized I'd forgotten an extra stack of seating cards in the hallway. As I walked toward the entrance, I heard familiar voices around the corner. Linda was talking to two of our cousins. I wasn't trying to listen. I simply stopped when I heard my name. I honestly don't know how Emma does it, Linda said with a soft laugh. One cousin asked, What do you mean? Linda lowered her voice. I mean, Emma must get exhausted paying for everything while her mother just has all the time in the world. There was a short silence. Then Linda added, I'd be tired too if I had to keep supporting my own parent. The morning of the wedding started much quieter than I expected. Emma was already awake when I arrived at the bridal suite. She stood by the window in a robe, holding a cup of coffee she hadn't touched. You've been awake for hours, haven't you? I asked. She smiled. Is it that obvious? You've stirred that coffee exactly twice. She laughed. I can't believe today's actually here. I tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. You've planned this day for almost a year. I know. And somehow, I still feel unprepared. You don't. She looked at me through the mirror. You always say things like that. Because they're usually true. She finally took a sip of coffee. I just want everyone to get along. I smiled. That's every bride's impossible dream. For a few minutes, we talked about everything except the wedding, her honeymoon, the apartment she and Ryan had just rented, whether she'd remember to eat before the ceremony. Normal conversations that somehow mattered the most. The ceremony itself was beautiful, simple, exactly the way Emma wanted it. No one cared about expensive decorations once she started walking down the aisle. Every face turned toward her, mine included. I don't mind admitting I cried. Just enough that Emma caught me wiping my eyes and smiled before taking Ryan's hand. By the time everyone moved into the reception hall, the atmosphere felt light again. People relaxed. Music filled the room. Kids ran between tables while grandparents pretended not to notice. A few guests I'd never met introduced themselves. One older couple asked how I knew the bride. I'm her mother. The woman looked surprised. I thought maybe you were one of her old teachers. I laughed. No, just Mom. You have that patient teacher energy. Another guest smiled. I would have guessed you volunteered somewhere. What makes you say that? You seem calm. I smiled. I've had a lot of practice. We talked for another minute before they headed toward the buffet. It struck me as funny. Complete strangers assumed I'd spent my life helping people. Some of my own relatives assumed I'd spent it doing nothing. Across the room, Linda was impossible to miss. She seemed to know someone at every table. Every few minutes, I'd hear another burst of laughter. She looked completely in her element. Confident, polished, always telling another story about work. Even when people changed the subject, she somehow brought it back to her company. Mark stayed close behind her, smiling politely whenever someone spoke to him. He still had that careful expression I'd noticed all week. Once our eyes met, he gave me a small nod. I returned it. Emma found me near the dessert table. You okay? I'm having a nice time. She searched my face anyway. You'd tell me if you weren't. I would. She hugged my arm. I mean it. I know. A bridesmaid called her away for pictures. I watched her leave, smiling. For a while, I forgot about Linda. I forgot about family gossip. I was simply a mother watching her daughter enjoy the happiest day of her life. Then I noticed Linda hurrying toward the entrance. She looked excited, almost nervous. She smoothed her jacket and greeted a tall man in a dark suit. It's so good you could make it. Even from across the room, I could tell she was trying hard to impress him. Emma quietly stepped beside me. That's him. I looked over. Daniel Carter? She nodded. Aunt Linda's boss. Daniel smiled politely as relatives introduced themselves. One of the ushers walked over. Linda, where would you like Mr. Carter to sit? She answered without looking at the seating chart. Right here. She pointed straight at our family table. I want him sitting with us. Daniel took the seat Linda had picked for him without making a fuss. He shook hands with Ryan's parents, congratulated the newlyweds, and thanked Emma for inviting him. I'm glad you could make it, Emma said. So am I, he replied. It's nice to be invited to something that isn't a board meeting. That earned a few laughs around the table. Linda smiled a little too proudly. I told everyone you almost never accept invitations outside of work. Daniel gave a polite smile. I try not to make a habit of working all the time. Mark quietly added, that's probably healthy. Linda glanced at him but didn't respond. Dinner was served, and for a while, the conversation stayed exactly where it belonged. People complimented the food. Ryan's uncle told a funny story about getting lost on the way to the ceremony. Emma and Ryan were interrupted every few minutes by relatives asking for photos. It felt easy, comfortable. I was grateful for that. Daniel wasn't the loudest person at the table. Actually, he barely spoke unless someone asked him a direct question. He seemed much more interested in listening than talking. That surprised me. Based on the way Linda described him all week, I expected someone much more intimidating. Instead, he paid attention. Really paid attention. When Emma talked about the nonprofit where she volunteered on weekends, Daniel asked thoughtful questions. When Ryan described renovating their first home, Daniel listened without checking his phone once. Small things, but they stood out. Linda, on the other hand, seemed determined to keep steering every conversation back toward work. Our company has been growing so fast, she said. Daniel nodded politely. We've been busy. Linda laughed. Busy is an understatement. She turned toward our relatives. You wouldn't believe the kind of decisions executives have to make every day. One of my cousins smiled awkwardly. I don't think I'd survive in that world. Linda looked pleased. It's definitely not for everyone. I noticed Mark quietly focus on his dinner again. He barely said a word. At one point, Daniel asked Emma how she'd chosen the venue. While she answered, I happened to glance across the table. Daniel was looking at me, not in a rude way, more like he was trying to remember something. The moment our eyes met, he looked back at Emma. A few minutes later, it happened again. This time, I wondered if I knew him from somewhere. His face felt familiar. Not familiar enough that I could place it. Just familiar. I searched my memory. Conferences, industry events, old clients. Nothing came to mind. Maybe I was imagining it. People sometimes stare without realizing they are. The conversation shifted again when one of Linda's coworkers asked how long she'd been with the company. Almost 6 years, Linda answered proudly. And hopefully, many more. Daniel smiled. You've certainly been dedicated. I try. She glanced around the table before adding, hard work always gets noticed. I wasn't sure whether that comment was meant for Daniel or the rest of us. Maybe both. Emma leaned toward me and whispered, everything okay? I smiled. I'm fine. You've gone quiet. I'm just listening. She gave my hand a quick squeeze under the table before turning back to Ryan. Daniel noticed the gesture. I caught him watching for just a second. Then he looked away again. The speeches were scheduled to begin once everyone finished dessert. Staff members started clearing plates while guests slowly turned their chairs toward the dance floor. Someone tested the microphone. It squealed for half a second before the sound settled. A few people laughed. The wedding planner walked over to our table. We're ready whenever the family is. Linda was already pushing her chair back. She smoothed the front of her dress, picked up her champagne glass, and smiled toward Daniel before looking around the room. If everyone could give me just a minute, she said as she reached for the microphone. I'd love to say a few words about my wonderful little sister and our family. Linda smiled as if she'd been waiting all evening for this moment. She tapped the microphone once. I promise I'll keep this short. A few guests laughed. She raised her glass toward Emma and Ryan. First of all, congratulations to the beautiful couple. Everyone applauded. Emma smiled warmly, reaching for Ryan's hand. You two are starting an amazing chapter together, Linda continued. I couldn't be happier for both of you. For a moment, it was exactly the kind of speech every wedding needs. She shared a funny story about Emma getting lost on her first day of kindergarten. Another about Emma insisting she'd never get married because boys were too loud. Even Emma laughed. The room felt relaxed again. I caught myself smiling. Maybe I'd worried for nothing. Linda turned slightly toward me. And of course, none of this would have been possible without my little sister, Maya. Several people looked my way. I gave a small wave from my seat. Linda smiled. Maya has always had a unique way of living. A few guests chuckled politely. I felt Emma glance toward me. I kept my expression calm. Linda continued. Some people spend their lives building careers. She paused just long enough for people to keep listening. And some people become experts at having free time. Another ripple of laughter moved across the room. Mark looked down at the table. He didn't smile. Neither did I. Linda lifted one shoulder as if it were harmless. You all know Maya. My sweet little sister hasn't worked in years. She laughed softly into the microphone. I guess somebody has to keep unemployment interesting. Several guests laughed again, not loudly. Mostly the kind of laugh people give when they aren't sure if they're supposed to. I noticed a few relatives avoiding eye contact with me. Others simply smiled awkwardly. They probably assumed this was normal family teasing. Emma's smile disappeared. She started pushing her chair back. Mom! Her voice was barely above a whisper. I looked at her and gave the smallest shake of my head. Not here. Not today. She stared at me for a second. I gently touched her wrist under the table. Please. She bit the inside of her lip. Every part of her wanted to stand up. I could see it. But she slowly sat back down. Ryan quietly rested a hand on her shoulder. Linda either didn't notice or didn't care. She took another sip of champagne before continuing. Honestly, if our family hadn't been around, I don't know what Maya would have done. She laughed again. She's been living off family support for so long that she's practically made it a career. This time, the laughter spread farther across the room. A few people even clinked their glasses. Someone at another table muttered, "That's sisters for you." I lowered my eyes to my plate. Not because I was ashamed, because I refused to let my daughter's wedding become a public argument. I'd spent 3 years learning that not every accusation deserves an immediate answer. Silence isn't always surrender. Sometimes it's a decision. Emma reached for my hand beneath the table. She squeezed it so tightly, I almost smiled. She knew. She knew exactly how much effort it was taking for me to stay where I was. Across the table, Mark shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Linda," he said quietly. She ignored him. Instead, she turned toward Daniel with a confident smile. "You've probably never met anyone like my sister." Her tone was playful, almost proud. "As you can see, she's the unemployed relative who somehow always lands on her feet." More laughter. Not everyone joined in this time. Some guests simply looked from Linda to me, trying to decide whether this had gone too far. I didn't look at anyone. I picked up my water glass and took a slow sip. The room gradually became quiet again. Linda seemed satisfied. She waited for another laugh. It never really came. That was when I noticed movement beside her. Daniel hadn't smiled once during the entire speech. Without saying a word, he slowly set his glass on the table. The room stayed quiet, not the comfortable kind of silence, the kind where everyone suddenly realizes the mood has shifted, but no one knows why. Daniel's hand rested on the table beside the glass he just set down. He didn't look at Linda. He looked straight at me. His eyes narrowed slightly, almost as if he were trying to confirm something he'd been thinking about all evening. I looked back, equally confused. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he smiled. Not a polite business smile, a genuine one. "Maya?" He said my name carefully, like he wasn't sure he'd heard it correctly earlier. I nodded. "Yes." Linda quickly laughed into the microphone. "Oh, you two haven't met. This is my little sister?" Daniel gently interrupted her. "No." He never raised his voice. "I think we have." Every conversation in the room seemed to stop. Linda lowered the microphone a little. "I'm sorry." Daniel kept looking at me. "I'm Daniel Carter." "I know," I said with a small smile. "I just wasn't expecting to see you here." His expression softened. "I wasn't expecting to see you either." Emma looked from me to Daniel, then back again. "You two know each other?" I nodded once. "We've met." Linda frowned. "From where?" I hadn't decided how to answer. Daniel answered for me. "Professionally." That single word changed the atmosphere around the table. Linda blinked. "You work together?" "Not exactly." Daniel pulled his chair back slightly. "My company worked with Maya." I noticed Mark slowly lift his head for the first time all evening. Several relatives exchanged confused looks. One of my cousins quietly asked, "I thought Maya hadn't worked in years." Daniel glanced toward him. 3 years. He said it matter-of-factly. Before that, she had quite a career. Nobody spoke. Even Linda seemed unsure what to say next. She forced a laugh. "Well, I guess it's a small world." Daniel gave her a polite smile, but his attention returned to me almost immediately. "How have you been?" There wasn't a hint of judgment in his voice, only sincere curiosity. "I've been doing well," I answered, taking life a little slower. He nodded as though he understood exactly what I meant. "I'm glad to hear that." Emma leaned toward me. "Mom." Her voice was barely audible. "You never told me." "I've told you stories about work." "Not about him?" I smiled. "There wasn't much reason to." Daniel heard that and chuckled. "I suppose that's true." Linda looked increasingly uncomfortable. "I'm sorry," she said, trying to recover. "I'm a little confused." Daniel finally turned toward her. "You didn't know?" "Know what?" He seemed genuinely surprised. "I assumed Maya had mentioned us at some point." I quietly shook my head. "I didn't," he smiled. "That sounds like you." Someone at the next table had clearly started listening. Then another. Within seconds, people who had been chatting among themselves were watching our table instead. The wedding planner paused halfway across the room. Even the photographer lowered his camera for a moment. Linda noticed the attention. She laughed again, though this time it sounded forced. Well, apparently my sister has been keeping secrets, I answered calmly. Not secrets. I just don't spend much time talking about my old job. Daniel nodded. That was always one of your strengths. Linda folded her arms. So, what exactly did Maya do? Daniel looked at me first, almost asking permission without saying the words. I gave the smallest shrug. I was in operations. Linda smiled as though that confirmed something. Oh, so middle management? Daniel let out a quiet breath. No, just one word. Simple, firm. The smile disappeared from Linda's face. Daniel rested both hands on the table. Then he looked directly at me again. We've actually been trying to reach you. I tilted my head. Reach me? For quite a while. The room seemed to grow even quieter. Daniel smiled. We've been trying to contact you for the past 3 years. No one spoke for a few seconds. I could almost hear people trying to make sense of what Daniel had just said. Linda forced a laugh. 3 years? She looked at me. Maya, you've never mentioned that. I shrugged. There wasn't much to mention. Daniel smiled politely. I don't think that's true. He folded his hands on the table, speaking calmly, almost as if we were catching up over coffee instead of sitting in the middle of a wedding reception. We reached out several times. I know, I admitted. I received the emails. Emma turned toward me. You got emails? I did. You never told me. I didn't think it mattered anymore. Daniel gave a small shake of his head. It mattered to us. The room grew quiet again. Even people from nearby tables had stopped pretending they weren't listening. Linda glanced around, suddenly aware that the attention she had wanted was no longer on her. I'm confused, she said. If the company wanted Maya back, why didn't she go? I answered before Daniel could. My mother needed me. Daniel nodded immediately. She told us that. His voice carried no hesitation. When Maya resigned, everyone assumed she'd be back after taking some leave. He looked at me. But you were very clear. I smiled faintly. I was. I remember exactly what you said. He paused for a moment. You told us, my mother only gets one ending. The projects can wait. Emma lowered her eyes. I hadn't realized I still remembered those words until Daniel repeated them. Neither of us spoke for a moment. Then Ryan quietly reached over and held Emma's hand. One of my cousins finally broke the silence. So, what exactly did Maya do? Daniel looked around the table. I thought everyone here already knew. Nobody answered. He let out a quiet breath. Maya wasn't just part of our operations team. He looked directly at Linda. She built the framework that several departments still rely on today. Linda blinked. What? Daniel continued as though it were the most ordinary fact in the world. A lot of the management systems our regional offices use were designed under Maya's leadership. I could see Linda searching his face, waiting for him to smile and admit he was exaggerating. He didn't. Mark slowly looked at me. I honestly never knew that. I smiled politely. There wasn't much reason for you to. Daniel chuckled softly. That's Maya. He looked at the rest of the family. She never cared much about titles. One of Linda's co-workers spoke up. Wait, are you talking about the Bennett operations model? Daniel nodded. Exactly. The co-worker's eyebrows shot up. I thought that was developed by a consulting team. No, Daniel smiled. It was led by Maya. A few people around the table exchanged surprised looks. Emma stared at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not shock, curiosity, as if she had suddenly realized there was a whole chapter of my life she'd never asked about. Mom, I met her eyes. We'll talk later? She nodded. I'd like that. Linda shifted in her chair. So, Maya left because of Grandma? Yes, I answered. And you never came back? No. Daniel answered before anyone asked another question. We offered. He looked toward me. More than once? I know. We adjusted the role? I remember. We even discussed remote leadership. I smiled. You did. Linda frowned. And she still said no? Daniel's answer came without hesitation. Every single time. He wasn't criticizing me. If anything, he sounded impressed. I've worked with a lot of talented people, he continued, but very few were willing to walk away at the peak of their careers for the reasons Maya did. No one interrupted him. The room felt different now, not because people suddenly admired me, because they realized the story they'd believed for years was missing almost every important part. Linda slowly set her champagne glass down. So, who took over your position? Daniel let out a quiet laugh. We've had several people try. He glanced at me one more time before answering. But if I'm being honest, he smiled. We've never really replaced Maya. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was thoughtful. For the first time all evening, no one seemed interested in making jokes. Emma looked at me with a mixture of surprise and curiosity. Mom, why didn't you ever tell me all of this? I smiled gently. You were busy building your own life? That's not an answer. No, I admitted, it isn't. I took a slow breath. I just didn't want my past to become the most interesting thing about me. Ryan nodded quietly. I can understand that. One of my uncles leaned forward. Maya, if your company valued you that much, why leave completely? It wasn't an accusation, it was an honest question. I appreciated that. I folded my hands together. Because my mother needed someone every day. I glanced at the empty chair beside Emma, thinking of my own mother for just a moment. The nurses were wonderful, but they weren't family. Daniel nodded. She's right, I continued. The treatments became harder. Some mornings, Mom couldn't get out of bed. Other days, she couldn't remember whether she'd taken her medication. Emma reached for my hand again. I remember some of that. You were working full-time? I said softly. I didn't want you carrying that weight too. She looked down. I would have helped. I know. And you did. Every chance you got. The conversation settled into a quieter rhythm. No one interrupted. No one checked a phone. For once, everyone simply listened. Daniel spoke again. We tried everything we could think of. A few heads turned toward him. We offered Maya an extended leave. He counted on his fingers. Then a consulting role. A reduced schedule. Remote leadership. He smiled at me. I think HR was convinced we'd eventually find an arrangement you'd accept. I laughed softly. They were persistent. They were desperate. That earned a small laugh around the table, breaking the tension for the first time in several minutes. Daniel continued, but every conversation ended the same way. He looked at me. You always thanked us. And then you said your place was with your mother. I nodded, because it was. One of Linda's co-workers shook his head. I don't think many people would have made that decision. Maybe not, I replied, but I wasn't comparing my life to anyone else's. I was simply trying to make peace with my own choices. Mark finally spoke. It was the first time I'd heard more than a sentence from him all evening. I remember Linda saying, you retired because you were burned out. I looked at him. I never said that. He slowly nodded. I guess. I never asked. Those 5 words landed harder than I expected. I guess I never asked. Neither had anyone else. People had filled in the blanks with assumptions because assumptions were easier than conversations. Emma quietly wiped a tear from the corner of her eye. I wish I'd asked more questions too. I squeezed her hand. You asked the ones that mattered. She smiled through watery eyes. Linda had been unusually quiet. She stared down at the table, turning her champagne glass in slow circles with her fingertips. She wasn't defensive anymore. She looked unsettled. Finally, she looked at me. Maya. Her voice was much softer than before. Did you really turn down promotions? I nodded. More than one. And you never regretted it? I thought about my mother's laugh. The afternoons we'd spent watching old movies in the living room. The nights when she couldn't sleep unless someone sat beside her. I smiled. I miss my mother every day. I paused. But I've never regretted choosing her. Daniel looked down for a second before quietly saying, neither would I. No one spoke. The music from the dance floor drifted into the silence. Some guests had started dancing, completely unaware that our table felt like a different world now. Linda cleared her throat. She looked around the family, then back at me. I think everyone's taking what I said the wrong way. She forced a nervous smile. I was only joking. No one answered. The rest of the reception slowly found its rhythm again. The band started another song. Guests returned to the dance floor. Children chased each other between tables as if nothing unusual had happened. But around our family table, something had changed. People weren't avoiding me anymore. Several relatives stopped to ask about my mother, not out of curiosity, out of genuine concern. One aunt quietly said, "I wish I'd called you more." I smiled. So do I. There wasn't any anger in my voice, just honesty. As the evening went on, Emma and Ryan were pulled away for more photos, leaving me with a rare moment alone near the garden outside the reception hall. The evening air felt cool, peaceful. I was looking at the lights hanging from the trees when I heard footsteps behind me. "Maya!" I turned. Linda stood a few feet away, holding her shoes in one hand. For the first time all day, she didn't look like the confident executive everyone knew. She looked tired. "I didn't want to interrupt you." "You aren't." She hesitated before stepping closer. "I owe you an apology." I stayed quiet. She took a slow breath. "I really thought I knew what happened." "I know." "I kept telling myself you had just stopped trying." She laughed once, but there was no humor in it. "I never actually asked?" "No. I just filled in the blanks." The words hung between us. Finally, she looked me in the eye. "I'm sorry." It wasn't dramatic. There were no tears. Just a woman realizing she'd believed her own assumptions for far too long. "I appreciate you saying that," I replied. She nodded. "I don't expect everything to be fixed tonight." "It won't be." "I know." For a moment, neither of us said anything. Then Emma walked outside. She looked from Linda to me, clearly wondering if she'd interrupted something. "You didn't?" I said. She joined us. Linda looked at her. "I owe you an apology too." Emma folded her arms but didn't walk away. "I've been unfair to your mom." "You have." There wasn't any anger in Emma's voice, just certainty. Linda accepted it. "I kept acting like she didn't want to work." Emma looked at me before answering. "Mom got job offers." Linda frowned. "More than one?" Emma nodded. "I saw some of them." She smiled gently at me. She didn't turn them down because she couldn't do the work. She turned them down because every time she tried to picture going back, she realized she still wasn't ready. I let out a quiet breath. Grief doesn't follow a schedule. Linda looked down. I never understood that. "I probably didn't explain it very well," I admitted. Both of them looked at me. I stayed quiet because I didn't want my life to become a constant explanation. I smiled sadly. But silence leaves empty spaces. Emma squeezed my arm. "And people filled those spaces with assumptions." I nodded. "They did." Linda slowly shook her head. "I was one of them." "You were." She looked genuinely embarrassed. "I wish I could take back those jokes." "I believe you." She looked surprised. "You do?" "I do." "Even after tonight?" I smiled. Believing someone is sorry doesn't erase what happened. It just means I don't have to carry it forever. Linda's eyes watered for the first time. She quickly looked away. "I'll do better." "I hope so." The conversation settled into a comfortable silence. Not because everything had been solved, because for the first time in years, we were actually talking instead of assuming. The reception carried on inside. Someone cheered as another song started. Emma laughed softly. "I should probably get back before Ryan thinks I've disappeared." She hugged me. Then, after a brief hesitation, she hugged Linda too. It wasn't a perfect reconciliation, but it was a beginning. As they walked back toward the ballroom, another familiar voice called my name. "Maya." I turned to see Daniel standing near the doorway with his suit jacket over one arm. He smiled. "I've been thinking." I waited. He stepped a little closer. "So let me ask you one last question." His expression was calm. "If we asked again." He paused just long enough for me to meet his eyes. "Would your answer still be no?" I looked at Daniel for a moment before answering. He wasn't trying to recruit me in the middle of my daughter's wedding. I knew him well enough to recognize the difference. He was simply asking. "No," I said with a small smile. "At least, not today?" He nodded immediately. "I figured." "But..." That made him pause. "I've been thinking about working again." Emma and Linda had stepped back toward us without interrupting. "I just don't think I want my old life back." Daniel listened without saying a word. I spent decades measuring my life by meetings, flights, and deadlines. I smiled to myself. I don't regret those years. They gave me a career I was proud of. I glanced through the ballroom windows where Emma and Ryan were laughing with friends. But now I want something different. Daniel folded his jacket over his arm. What does different look like? I honestly don't know yet. I laughed softly. And that's okay. Maybe consulting. Maybe mentoring. Maybe part-time. For the first time in my life, I don't feel like I have to chase the next title. He smiled. I had a feeling you'd say something like that. I still enjoy solving problems. I just don't want work to become my entire identity again. Daniel extended his hand. Whenever you're ready, whether that's 6 months from now or 6 years from now, I hope you'll call. I shook his hand. Thank you. I mean that. So do I. He gave me one last nod before heading back inside to congratulate the bride and groom once more. Linda remained where she was. She looked at the ground for a few seconds before speaking. I've been thinking about something. I waited. You know, when Daniel started talking tonight, she let out a slow breath. My first thought wasn't that I'd hurt you. I looked at her. My first thought was that I'd embarrassed myself in front of my boss. She gave a disappointed shake of her own head. And I hate that about myself. She didn't try to excuse it. She didn't blame stress or alcohol. She simply said it out loud. Then I kept replaying everything you've said about Grandma. Her voice cracked slightly. I realized I spent years judging someone whose story I never bothered to learn. I could hear the music drifting outside from the reception. For a few seconds, neither of us filled the silence. Finally, she looked at me. I'm sorry because of that. Not because Daniel knew you, because I should have known you. That was the first apology that truly felt complete. I stepped closer and gave her a brief hug. It wasn't the kind of hug that erased 3 difficult years. But it didn't pretend those years had never happened either. Sometimes that's enough. Emma walked over with Ryan beside her. She slipped her arm through mine. You okay? I smiled. I think I am. She looked at Linda, then back at me. I've waited a long time to see people finally listen to you. I laughed. The funny thing is, I wasn't trying to prove anyone wrong. Emma tilted her head. No. I shook my head. I spent so much energy worrying about being misunderstood. Tonight reminded me that the truth doesn't always need to fight for attention. Sometimes it just needs time. Ryan smiled. That's probably the calmest way anyone could have handled tonight. I wasn't always calm. I laughed. I've just had a lot of practice. We stayed for another hour. There was dancing, more photographs, a slice of wedding cake I was too full to finish. By the end of the night, relatives spoke to me differently, not because they had suddenly discovered my resume, because they had finally asked about my life. As Emma hugged me goodbye before leaving for her honeymoon, she whispered, I'm proud of you. I kissed her forehead. I've always been proud of you. Walking toward my car, my phone vibrated. It was a text from Daniel, just one sentence. If you ever decide to come back, the door is still open. I stood there for a moment, looking at the screen. 3 years ago, I would have deleted that message without a second thought. This time, I slipped my phone back into my pocket. Not because I'd made a decision, because for the first time in a very long time, I didn't feel the need to close the door immediately. Life had finally become quiet enough to leave it open. If you've ever been misunderstood because people only saw one chapter of your life, I'd genuinely like to hear your story. Let me know where you're watching from and share what you think. Should Maya have corrected her family years earlier, or was waiting for the truth to reveal itself the better choice?